Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for your patience. We are starting right on time, or maybe a minute late. We'll try to make up for it as we go along. My name is Famida Vangert. I am lead for sustainability with IT Renew, and it's my distinct pleasure today to host a panel on gearing up for sustainability. If you have not heard the keynote this morning, please visit it later. It set up the stage for sustainability, circularity, and how we are all part of the supply chain solution in a really, really critical way. So the goal for this panel is that I'm going to spend a little bit of time setting up the stage for sustainability and circularity and what to expect. And then I have three fine colleagues with me, Kari here in person, and John and Jordan online. So I'd like a thumbs up from our great AV team that they're available. And every now and then you're going to see their faces pop up. So that's the plan, most of the time in dialogue, not very many PowerPoints. So hopefully it'll be a lively discussion for you. Gearing up for sustainability. The reason why we chose this name for this first panel of this track, one, because this is the first time we are having a sustainability track at OCP. Very big deal for those of us who have been working on this initiative tirelessly for the last 7-8 months. And also in the collaborative way, the companies and the OCP membership and the staff have come together to support. And you've heard this so many times at the opening keynote session after session, every speaker mentioned how critical integrating sustainability and circularity is into this whole ecosphere of OCP solutions. So we are gearing up, we're kind of running towards it, and everything we talk about in this panel and onwards will really hopefully give you a lot of tools to consider and take it back to your organizations and see if we are collectively thinking in the right direction. And in the process, we will address circularity concepts and some key metrics. So to set the stage, here we are. And I wanted to take a minute to clarify or emphasize the relationship between sustainability and circularity. As we worked in the work streams, Kari, how many times have people asked us, are they the same? Do they mean the exact same thing, or are they different? And I think it's a really important question to address in the beginning, because that actually expands our work and our horizon and how it applies to OCP work. Sustainability, as we know, is the basic definition of meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of the future generations. This is what's embedded in all the 3 E's, environment, economy, equity, or 3 P's, people, profit, planet, and all the goals that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have created a pathway for. There are 17 different categories. So sustainability is always the overarching goals. And many of our companies are making critical commitments, net zero commitments on carbon reduction, zero waste commitments, maximizing water recycling commitments. They're all components and metrics towards sustainability. What is then circularity? This is a concept and a mechanism, a methodology that gets us to zero carbon faster in a more efficient way. Circularity definitely has 3 concepts embedded in it. One is that it designs waste out from the get-go. It also keeps products running in the life for as long as possible through its useful life. Very, very relevant for all our OCP work here. And of course, the third and the most important concept is that we regenerate the natural environment in the process without taking from it. So the diagram here, which is borrowed from City of Fremont and work Arup had done, that really shows that how in the linear economy, which is the process we've followed in all our industrial mechanism in the last 200 years, have kept the take and the dispose, and that's what has brought us here today. The recycling economy, one step forward, it still closes the loop on the recycling side, but there is still take and there's quite a bit of disposal. It's only when we come to circular economy that we are able to recycle, reuse, and reduce. And extension, product life extension, or reuse is a much higher form of sustainability in the circularity concept. So just a very basic review, we get these questions and it's going to have a bearing on the way we discuss in the rest of the panel. So in our work streams, in the morning in the strategic initiatives, DJ mentioned how we focused on sustainability circularity that is integrating across all of our OCP work, whether it's with the server group or a networking group, et cetera. And we really try to make sure that we set the foundation this year for more product guidelines and specific tools to come. In fact, there is a white paper that got published. I encourage all of you to take a look. It's under the resources for OCP. That is a call to action to information technology, communication technology companies, and how circularity relates to the work that we do. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to all our work stream, those of you joining online or here, that there's constant work, and many of our member companies, we invite you to actually join us as we move forward. Now, in circularity, for OCP equipment in general, and you've seen all these circular diagrams everywhere whenever circularity come into play. Design for circularity is really important. What we are designing today is what's going to have e-waste implications down the road. So to close the loop, we want to pay attention to design, material selection for all the components that are being designed or standardized, manufacturing. As we all heard how 75% of the embedded carbon that shows up in the Scope 3 accounting for a full carbon solution is really in manufacturing. And then there's the use phase, which is where the rest of the carbon shows up through the use of the grid in order to do the run of the hardware equipment. And then that begins the process of the next life and the next life. Second life is completely possible, as you heard from our keynote this morning, but individually component level, the products could have many lives, and that's what fulfills the promise of circularity. So really the design thinking and the long-term thinking of where materials are coming from, how they're built, and where they end up is critically important to circularity and beyond. So then let me open it up to our panel. Since we have a mix of in-person and online participants, unfortunately, we're going to have to follow a little bit of a rhythmic sequence. I will always kind of ask Kari first, and then we'll ask Jordan from Meta, who's joining us, and John Miranda from Intel, who's been a terrific partner to our work here. So with that, warm-up question for the panel. Why is circularity important to your company? How is it becoming relevant? And how is your company responding to this call to action? If you could share us some examples, Kari from Microsoft.
Thank you, Famida, and thanks for being here online and in person. Circularity for Microsoft is the way we are going to achieve our sustainability goals. And that's the way that I've started looking at circularity. It's really a framework that enables us to meet our carbon negative goal, our zero waste goal, our water positive goals, and our ecosystem goals. It's the way, if we can extend the life of the things we have in place, we increase the circularity, we circulate the materials and the products at its highest value, and we try to do that. We have the concept of our circular centers, which is a very important pillar for us, and the name obviously indicates that circularity is important to us. The circular centers is for us a way that we can, at the end of the first life, we have an opportunity to reroute our assets, reroute the parts to the optimal location, not only from a value generation perspective, but also from a sustainability perspective. So we're really hoping to make these components and make the assets last longer by having intelligent routing systems that enable us to put those to better use. I think one more element, though, that is really critical is what you mentioned, Famida, from the design stage. We really have to make decisions at the start of when we're thinking about a product and we think about solution in order to not only make sure it can be recycled and reused well, but also look at how can we reduce what goes into it in the first place. So the embodied carbon associated with it is, as Ali mentioned earlier, it is super critical. And that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how can we reduce carbon and waste in our supply chain. So, yeah.
Excellent. All right, let's see if our online panelists are able to join. Hello, guys, good to see you. I wish you were here. Jordan, tell us how Meta is expressing circularity in its work, examples you can share, and how the world of circularity has really evolved, in your opinion.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for setting the stage here, Famida. And you'll hear a lot of similar themes to what both you and Kari just mentioned. So at Meta, we set a goal to be net zero across our value chain in 2030, and that's building on the last decade's worth of work, focusing on how do we make the most sustainable operations and infrastructure. And so when we think about our net zero strategy, we have a three-pronged approach. And it's sort of in this priority, right? The very first step in that is how can we consume less? The second priority is can we swap out what we're using, solutions for renewable or lower carbon options? And then finally, to get it to net zero, what can we do to remove carbon from the atmosphere that we emit? And where I see circularity fitting into that overall strategy is really that very first priority. How can we design waste out of the system? How can we use less stuff? Our infrastructure, so our data centers, both the construction of the buildings as well as the hardware that goes into it, that is a significant driver of Facebook's carbon emissions. And so we've built these circularity strategies at all layers of our physical infrastructure, starting with data center construction. An example I'll share is, in 2020, 5 of our projects that earned LEED Gold certification for the building diverted over 75% of the construction materials from landfills. So that's a good example of designing waste out, as well as in the hardware. You'll hear some great examples later today, but embedding, circular design principles into our product development cycle. So things like low vanity, server design, serviceability, inclusion of recycled materials, which really, like Kari mentioned, what we do in the design phase really helps enable circularity within our operations and further downstream, and how we really run our server fleet. So those are just some of the examples of how circularity is really critical to how Meta will reach our 2030 goals.
It's great. John, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the lead off, Famida, and thank you everyone for joining us. So from Intel, there's a dual perspective. The first is the manufacturing side. So in 2020, we made renewable energy investments that offset 81% of our total global manufacturing operation. We made water restoration investments. We reduced our e-waste from manufacturing to 5%. But one area that's really taking off is more thinking about the business unit side of the company. So we design products that our customers use, and what's the impact of those? So looking at it from that lens, which is what I want to talk about this morning. So when you approach a technologist at Intel, a chip architect, and the same may be true if you're designing routers or switches or other components in data center. Efficiency is a muscle that's well developed. You can approach an architect and they're like, well, I've been trying to make chips efficient for decades. So what are you asking me to do that I'm not doing, working hard to do? And so when you start talking about circularity, you start expanding their aperture beyond an area that we need to continue working on. We need to continue making compute more efficient. But even as we make compute more efficient, we can increasingly see a path of offsetting the use of that compute with renewable investments, like the large data center operators are making investments that start netting out the operational impact of carbon from the electricity used to run the compute. So then that shifts the focus to, well, what do you go after next? And so you start thinking about the supply chain. And so how much carbon is embodied in all the equipment that's bought and placed inside data centers. And when you start thinking about it in that lens, at the beginning, when you're designing a product, any kind of product that goes in a data center, you should start thinking about modularity. Can I upgrade portions of it, but leave the rest of it alone? And let the rest of the components operate for a longer life, so you're amortizing that carbon over a more extended period. What's the software support life? When a software upgrade stops, does the hardware become a brick, or can it continue to operate? Are there notions of, kind of a digital passport, like a Carfax for the equipment? So end of life, you can help enable a secondary market. How repairable is it? Can it be remanufactured? Are you removing ingredients from the BOM that inhibit recycling at the end of the day? And within Intel, we're known, of course, for designing and producing chips, but we also designed the reference platform, the motherboard around the chip, the power delivery, all those kind of components. And we have an opportunity to influence the ecosystem, both on the laptop, desktop, as well as the server, by creating reference designs that others can adopt, that do things like reduce the size of the PCB footprint, which also takes a lot of energy to create. So you start thinking about circularity, and in talking with technologists, it's great to see, as you raise these principles, how their thinking expands beyond efficiency, which they'll continue to focus on, but starting to think more about that product life and the embodied carbon in it.
That's super interesting. So let's drill down a little bit deeper into who we are engaging in the supply chain. There is no doubt that in order to solve the climate crisis or to stabilize 1.5, and as we all know, COP26 negotiations are going on in Glasgow as we speak. Who are we really engaging? If each of you could share in the supply chain. Earlier in the keynote, I'm from IT Renew. You heard from Ali how we are engaging through the supply chain in connecting the dots with carbon. It starts with all the work that needs to be done with the product life extension, but also other methodologies like value recovery, in this case, the heat example, and of course, a submersion coming front. So that's a very data center specific example. Taking another step backwards in the meta picture, so to speak, sorry. Who are we really engaging in the supply chain to really get to that zero carbon solution? So perhaps a few examples from you, Kari, from Meta, and then from Intel.
Yeah, for sure. So as we know, our supply chain emissions are where we need to go and focus. So that is a huge effort for us. We have started with our closest suppliers, but also we've tried to understand where is the highest impact, identifying those suppliers where there is the most impact from a carbon perspective, and then also looking at other suppliers that the impact may not be super high, but they are really mature when it comes to sustainability. Because while the impact with that particular supplier may not be super significant, having the conversation and starting to increase the awareness around the language, I think we've heard that a lot across today and yesterday as well. Like, this is a net new language, and people don't really know how to talk about it. So for us, it's been figuring out, okay, who are the strategic partners for those two reasons that I mentioned, starting those engagements with them and having the conversation, simply saying, are you measuring your carbon? Are you accounting for your carbon? And just starting to ask those questions, because if they're not, well, maybe they will start thinking about it. And from Microsoft's perspective, they will have to start thinking about it, because we have also introduced in our contracts language that says, in the future, if you want to be a partner with us, we actually expect you. Along the other side, all the other things that we expect you to do, we expect you to start disclosing and reporting your carbon emissions. So we're trying to kind of work with our suppliers in a way. We understand that this transition to starting this new language, understanding one's footprint of something you never used to measure, takes time. So we're trying to engage with them, learn with them, and as much as we can provide resources for them to get up to speed or them to teach us. But then at the same time, leveraging our buying power and leveraging our contracts in order to push the industry in the right direction. And I think the last thing is the opportunities that we can come up with together through a circular economy and the new business models that is born out of that. And I think that's where also we have to talk to our maybe there are new suppliers in our supply chain with our circular centers or with coming up with net new materials, for example, that we'll be starting to introduce into our components. These new business models are also a really great starting point to have conversations with our suppliers and with the supply chain on sustainability. So that's a couple of ways that we approach it.
I know it's true because a lot of colleagues tell me about the Carbon Disclosure Project is one of the great ways that Microsoft's actually creating that awareness on data transparency and reporting on carbon disclosure. How about from maybe some examples from Meta and from Intel? And you can get down to specifics, to metrics or other transparency factors. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the beauty of this is that we share a very similar approach to Microsoft, as I'm sure Intel and many of our tech peers. And I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but I think that's kind of the magic of spaces like OCP. There are other forums out there, right, like the Responsible Business Alliance, REBA, where we can start to come together on common asks of our supply chain so that we're not reinventing the wheel, bringing others along who are maybe less mature, and really, sending a strong signal to oftentimes many shared suppliers. So what I'm going to describe will sound very similar to Kari in the sense that we need to first prioritize our supply chain. Obviously, the best or one of the first kind of prioritization metrics that we look at is where in our supply chain, where are the hot spots in our supply chain? And a really good way to do that is by conducting life cycle assessments of our products, getting a deeper understanding of, which commodities, which parts of the supply chain, which processes, which materials are really driving that carbon footprint. And that's something that we've actually all been collaborating on quite heavily within the strategic initiative. And I'm happy to talk about more. So, really prioritizing that supply chain. Similarly, we are reaching out to those key suppliers, starting the conversation with them. Some of them have not calculated their carbon footprint yet even. And so providing them the trainings, the resourcing, the resources that they need in order to do that accounting, help them calculate their own scope 3, which we know is an incredibly challenging space. Encourage them to set greenhouse gas targets, science-based target aligned greenhouse gas targets of their own, and then co-developing reduction action plans with them, which could include very many circular economy principles as well. So there's no silver bullet to this, and it takes time to build those relationships, build the trust, and make progress on this. But we have till 2030, so we're really starting now with a lot of these efforts.
John, any comments on supply chain engagement?
Yeah, I do. So primarily for me, I've been connecting more on our customer side than our upstream, so downstream, trying to understand from our largest customers, how are they framing the problem, how are they breaking it down, how are they unpacking it? Because sustainability and even circularity can be such a diffuse, complex topic, but how are they seeing it? And I have colleagues also, I'm on a data center side, but I have colleagues also on the kind of desktop laptop side, and they're working with OEMs where they did a complete teardown on your typical laptop and really examined every single part and try to assess its contribution. Like, what are the hotspots even? And are we even agreed? Because we may have thought one thing, and a major OEM was like, no, we're seeing it in a slightly different way. So that exchange is creating a lot of learning. I don't know that any one of us has the answer, but I think the interaction in environments such as what OCP can offer, which is more open, allows us to accelerate our mutual learning back and forth. And I think we need to do the same, even thinking about a server, it has over 1,000 parts in it. Where do you go after, right? And I think we all have intuition, but coming together, we can really get more precise and concrete on where are the opportunities. In any design, there's always trade-offs. I might improve this at the expense of that, but what are the right trade-offs and choices? So that's been the primary interaction I've had on the supply chain, more on the customer side.
Great. So one more question for all of you, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience and perhaps some questions from online as well. So barriers to do this. We're talking about sustainability, how circularity is a great delivery platform, but there are barriers. And my second plug for the ICT white paper that's out on OCP platform, we talk about the barriers there a little bit. The top three that come to mind, as we have all discussed, there's data security. This is a very, very strong requirement for our ICT industry and community, and that can pose some barriers to entry in making sure the circularity is designed in such a way that really helps extend our product to its full life, so to speak. There is also information, and it's a theme that's coming up, data transparency, not really knowing who has how much carbon, and when you add that all up, does it really equate to zero towards the net carbon 2030 goals? And there is also just that from design to use to manufacturing, things are not necessarily optimized for circularity today. So I would like to ask each of our panelists to maybe share some examples on what are some of the barriers that your respective companies are really trying to overcome to solve the pieces of this puzzle so we can all be in one circle together towards our net zero goals?
Yeah, I think if I can start, you brought it up, information or data, and it's a dual problem, or in the sense we don't really have accurate, good data to do. We've talked a lot about life cycle assessment, and it's quite difficult to get data associated with the newest technology node that you're all putting out there in the world, because we're not sharing it. Because we are still, even though we say we're collaborating, we are collaborating, but I think we really need to take a step up here together and stop thinking about sustainability as a competitive advantage, because it's not anymore. It's a given. You have to have it embedded. If not, someone's going to go somewhere else. And we really, truly have to drive collaboration and share information and data in order for us to get alignment on those numbers and not have one number here and one number there. But then the other hand, this is going to change all the time, and assumptions are also going to change all the time. So I think while we get really deep sometimes on data and we want it accurate, and I think we should continue to drive towards that, we also already know what we need to go do. And I think that's one thing, to get people on board and aligned directionally in order to say, you know what, we know that our hotspots are the major ISCs. In embodied carbon, we know that's where we need to go. And that is a really difficult problem to tackle as well in our industry, because we are quite dependent on that silicon.
Yeah.
And so, being able to move forward directionally while not having all the data and getting engineers and leaders on board to do that is tricky. But I think that is where we need to go. And I want to also just encourage everyone to collaborate after this by sharing information. And we can find ways to do that without giving up our competitive advantage, because at the end of the day, we really need this planet to be here for us, and we can help drive towards that if we collaborate truly better than we are today.
Yeah, thanks for teeing us up. Jordan, let's hear from you, and then John.
Sure, yeah, I really do want to build on what Kari mentioned, in the sense that we can't reduce what we don't measure. And a lot of the current methodologies that we have today, even the quote unquote best in class LCA process, oftentimes it's very difficult to reflect some of the activities and efforts that all of our companies are doing within some of these methodologies, just because they're not real-time digital twins of our real supply chain, right? So what is, to Kari's point, enough data that we can still work towards something? But of course, engineers love data, right? They want tools to in order to optimize these metrics, and so it's a challenge to try to strike that balance of providing that information, but also not getting kind of stuck in that analysis paralysis. I am really, really encouraged by a lot of the conversations we've been having this year within OCP, particularly around how we can surface and encourage our suppliers, build up their capacity to start reporting on these metrics on their own. Obviously, the end users, the big kind of FANG companies that have many resources, that's a very different scenario than for a lot of the suppliers in the supply chain. And we know it takes time and resourcing to do some of this work. So I am encouraged by the way that we're approaching it within OCP in terms of trying to reduce barriers so that we can kind of lift all boats as we work towards our shared goals.
John?
Yeah, I want to also echo on the data and the measurement. You know, one area that's interesting to me is thinking about the ultimate end person that's engaging the compute in the first place and how data can inform them to make the right trade-offs. So I keep using an example. If you run a medium-sized business and you run payroll in the cloud, how much carbon did you generate? And how much of it was operational? How much of it would be, let's say, an allocation from the equipment that you tied up? Does it matter if you run it at 10 a.m. or 5 p.m.? Because the energy sources are different when it's sunny. Does it matter if you run it in Poland versus Sweden? Because the fossil intensity can vary by 50x. But how do you provide that end consumer? If you're watching a movie on your phone, 1080p versus 4K, what's the difference? And until we're able to at least provide kind of that reporting to that end consumer, you know, I feel that's a great opportunity. And it can encompass elements of circularity, kind of the impact of the hardware that you're tying up, elements of operational, how much fossil-based energy are you consuming in trying to achieve whatever it is you're achieving. I'd like to see progress in kind of the telemetry that enables all that, and it's inclusive of data center, networking. It takes energy to move a bit from here to there. But how do you provide that holistic end state information so all ITDMs and all of society can start saying, you know what, I can run payroll at this time, and I know I'm using generating one third of the fossil emissions equivalent, and it's still okay. It meets my schedule, as an example.
Great. Well, we have some time left for Q&A. We wanted to actually have a conversation with all of you. So let's hear a couple of questions from the audience, and we'll take one from online. And through those answers, I'll ask my panelists to also kind of embed their closing remarks. So questions for us in terms of gearing up for sustainability, prepping for circularity, and how the companies can work together with true change management that's ahead of us. So do you have a question, ma'am?
Hi, are there any retrofit measures being taken up to address sustainability in existing data centers and existing servers that are in operation?
So the question is, are there retrofit opportunities that are being taken up for data centers that already exist, correct? Are you asking about energy efficiency retrofits or in general? Okay, answers? All of us are online, so you can jump right in.
I'm happy to start. Yeah, so we started off talking today about how hardware lifecycle extension and keeping the servers and racks in use for as long as possible, that kind of avoids the need to purchase new hardware and kind of refresh our data centers at such a constant rate. Intuitively, we know, right, that if you look at a rack, the lifespan of each individual component or subsystem, they have different life cycles. And so what we're trying to do is really, think about it not as just kind of one unit that goes in and out of our data centers, but how can we decouple the lifespans of each of these individual components? And that starts with design, of course, right? Making sure that the subsystems are modular enough that they can actually be extracted and reused. But it also has to deal with, operationally, what are the data monitoring health systems that we are putting in place in order to make sure that we can still maintain our reliability within the fleet. So one really great example, we shared a case study on this about a year ago, is the battery backup units that are in OpenRack V2. So we have leveraged battery health monitoring to better understand how these lithium ions degrade over its lifetime in the data center and actually very accurately predict each cell's life expectancy. And what we learned from that exercise is we can actually extend the lifespan of our lithium-ion based battery backup units to twice as long as a typical, server. And so with using that data, we're actually able to extend the life of these BBUs to additional rack life cycles and kind of maintain them in the fleet. So hopefully that answers your question. When I hear retrofits and refreshes of hardware, we're definitely looking at ways that we can optimize the life of all of the components within our hardware.
Anybody else want to jump in? Okay,
Maybe.
Yes, Hi, Taufik.
Maybe a quick one. I'm just curious if you can comment, like how deep in your engineering organizations this drive for sustainability goes. For example, if an engineer comes to a trade-off where he could greatly enhance, sustainability, but they have to give up, a little bit performance or extra cost, what kind of metrics do they have, and how do you enable them to make, those choices?
I think that's the question of not the century, but the decade, the year at least. We're in that process for sure. And I think what we are trying to do, our teams that sit on, I sit on a supply chain team, and we are very focused on sustainability. We're trying to equip all those engineers with the right data. So we're trying to establish baselines and say, you know what, and we've done some studies on this. They come to us and they say, look, we have this design, this old thing. Can you let me know what the carbon impact is of that? And then I want to make this change. And can you help me with the carbon impact of that? The thing is that you can't just put that into a tool right now and out it pops. So it's very resource intense, and you really need a whole bunch of environmental engineers to know how to do life cycle assessment to give those numbers. And so I think we have some way to go there. There is a lot of interest from our engineers. They really want this data. And I think what is, at least for me as a sustainability professional at a company like Microsoft, leveraging the support that we have from a corporate level to drive sustainability, to get the resources that we need to actually get that data to the engineer so he can go. And we have those conversations today in pockets where they go and say, hey, we know this is going to be this cost, this performance, and now all of a sudden they're starting to introduce that sustainability number. And so I think we would love for it to be more embedded, but I think it's just a journey we all have to be on. And what I encourage everyone who are in engineering roles to do is go ask that question, or go find your sustainability person, or go get some resources to go get an LCA so you can start showing those numbers up in front of your leaders to then get resources for it. But I'd love to hear from the others too, if there's anything.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think that's a conversation that we're still developing our muscle on. To the earlier point, like by tradition, at least in Intel and chip design, efficiency has been the thing, right? Like how to make it compute faster, better performance, lower energy, Moore's law, all those kinds of things. But we have significantly ramped up internal conversations now around LCA and circularity, and I think it's a journey. We still have a ways to go, but I'm seeing more across different levels. Yesterday, Intel's Zane Ball, about a third of his keynote was on sustainability and included circularity. I don't think that would have, that wasn't there a year ago, right? So we're embracing this conversation at all levels, but I think we still have a ways to go to answer the question.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add to, just to close out, I think, increasingly so, we need to expand, I think, our view of like the cost benefit analysis when it comes to sustainability. Not all sustainability initiatives are going to cost money. Some could even save money. And there's also a cost of doing nothing. And, I think we've seen tremendously over the last year, 2 years, couple of years, just the increasing number of extreme weather events and their impact on our infrastructure. And if we aren't building systems that are resilient to that, supply chains that are resilient to that, the cost is going to be astronomical. And so you hear when you talk about climate, we've been talking a lot about mitigation. What can we do to reduce our contribution to this global, to global warming? But there's also the resiliency piece, which I feel like doesn't get talked about as much, but is super, super important to the the whole cost benefit analysis equation. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
No, that's great. And I'll add sort of the institutional decision-making process. Your question, Taufik, is also that of change management inside the organization. So for sustainability to be an authentic and true priority, that means that the voice of those metrics in terms of efficiency, zero carbon, zero waste, those need to be the key performance indicators at the executive level decision making as well. And for that to happen, the organizational priority of sustainability, not just in terms of symbolic having an office of sustainability, but at the decision table. I know in this panel we haven't talked a whole lot about the decision systems and how to really integrate sustainability and circularity as the ethos and the indicators that the executives actually pay attention to and make decisions on, but that is absolutely the secret sauce. So the change management associated with the value chain lining up, so all our carbon does add up to zero, so to speak, is really the art and science of this decade of climate action. So let's incorporate that in our perspective as well, so that the voices of engineering is not value engineered out at the decision system just based on the cost metric. Cost is important, sustainability metrics would have to be important, and circularity would have to be the delivery mechanism. Last question from you.
Hi, George Porter, UCSD. This is a very interesting conversation. I've been really enjoying this. So one question I had was, in talking to some folks about product lifetime extension and extending the life of ICT, virtualization can play a role with storage, with compute, things like that. But what about the network? So what role do you see, as networking technology goes from 10 to 40 to 100, et cetera, gigabits a second? Is there a role for older networking equipment in the data center, or does that just sort of have to be thrown away?
No, there is a role for every equipment. So through the lens of carbon, if the accounting of that footprint is available, then the decision can be made on what level of extension would then equate to the life cycle analysis. So I think we keep talking about carbon accounting really being the secret sauce that's going to bind us together, but it's not specific to one equipment or the other. They all need to be viewed in terms of both the efficiency bucket and also how to extend their product lives. The other clarifying point, and perhaps I have a bias here with the reuse being a premier solution, is that reuse is a premier solution, because with the existing inventory of equipment that we have, at the pace that the ICT is exploding, there is no way to get to zero carbon unless we are reusing the existing inventory of all the pieces of the hardware equipment, so to speak. So I'll open this up to our panelists too, and also add your concluding remarks with it, as we have a minute and a half left on this panel. Anyone?
I'll just, go ahead, John, please.
I was just going to say real quickly, I'm not an expert in the progression of network technology inside a data center, but it seems to be that there will be data center use cases that require high performance, the fastest networking speed available. But then there's going to be use cases, maybe batch jobs, things like that, or secondary market data centers in emerging countries or other parts of the world, where 5-year-old networking equipment is more than adequate. And so how to connect and enable those secondary markets seems like it'd be an important approach.
Absolutely. That was exactly the point I was going to make to John. Even within Meta's infrastructure, so got to get used to that. Even within our infrastructure, we don't refresh all 20 plus data center regions that we have all at once. So there is this temporal aspect to how we refresh our data centers. But to John's point, right, circularity does not have to happen all internally within our four walls. Circularity can happen with a totally separate user that might not have some of the performance requirements that we require, but could greatly benefit from this hardware that still has a lot of useful life left, and at a lower cost than brand new hardware. So definitely circularity can extend beyond just the Metas of the world. So just wanted to add that.
No, beautiful. Thank you so much. I think, in some of the closing comments, if we can kind of quickly go back to the PowerPoint on call to action, join us. So this work stream was really a labor of love for us in the last 7-8 months. We have published a paper. There are more guidelines coming. The next one queued up is Design for Circularity, where we get into a lot of the questions discussed today, but with more specifics for all OCP audience. So the language for that is going to be common to all. We want to create more dialogue and integrate the goals that the companies, our respective companies, are setting towards net zero through full transparency and accountability. So there is going to be a lot more conversation and guidelines around carbon accounting, really understanding the role of avoided emissions, and really understanding how all of this can be recognized in the greenhouse gas emissions protocol. So again, we can tie and close the loop in the value chain and get to zero carbon. So join us and ask us any questions about circularity and how to embed circularity in your planning process. And I think the final thing we wanted to share with all of you is that circularity, again, is a really clean and fast delivery mechanism of sustainability, but the key metrics of sustainability, zero carbon, reduced cost, full economic benefit, and full transparency through value chain is really the collective benefit of this particular vision. So thank you so much for your time, and stick around for our next panels. Thank you. Thank you, Kari, Jordan, and John.
Thank you. Thank you.